Good morning. I'm doing this because it is right, because it is fair, and because it is what I believe in. Let me put it this way. Nations depend on rules, fair rules. Sometimes they're written down, often they're not. But either way, they give shape to our values, guide us towards our rights, of course, but also our responsibilities, the obligations we owe to each other. Without them, we risk becoming an island of strangers, not a nation that walks forward together.
Who now has anything to say about the deindustrialization of this country?
Georgian townhouses on the moon, the highest GDP per capita in the Milky Way. Small modular reactors under every village green. This is Anglofuturism.
Listeners, welcome to a special episode of the Anglofuturism podcast. It is my great pleasure to reintroduce myself, Tomo, and Callum Drysdale. We are not in space in this episode. Instead, as you can probably tell from the sounds of the sea, we are bobbing about in our favourite atoll. Callum, where are we?
We are sitting in a little jolly boat just outside the lagoon of Diego Garcia, the largest island of the Chagos archipelago that make up the British Indian Ocean territory that we feared was not long to remain British. And yet we received some rather exciting news, didn't we, Tom?
Yes, a bolt from the blue a couple of nights ago. And it seems that nothing is certain yet. It's all up in the air. But number 10, who have been trying to give away these crucial strategic islands in the Indian Ocean, have essentially tried to slow the deal down, delay it, because they fear that their MPs will vote it down, because it doesn't make a very good contrast with their benefit cuts, because the deal, as Callum will explain, could end up being rather expensive for the country.
Yeah, exactly. And I think you're right, Tom, in saying that we don't necessarily have all the information yet. So maybe it's a little premature for our victory podcast, but maybe listeners will forgive us for still rushing to our microphones.
We're having a beer rather than champagne at this point.
At the moment with the weather, of course, Tom, that's every single night. So maybe it still makes even less of a change from normal. But yeah, I think the point is that even if the government has refused to accept that there's like £18 billion that we'd have to pay in order to be able to lease the islands back isn't the real number. It's a number that has basically frightened number 10 because it is such a stark amount to be paying, particularly when the government seems determined to cut back elsewhere, and particularly in areas that like Labour MPs really care about in a way that, other than a really small, hardcore group of them, they don't care about the Chagos Islands.
It's crazy money. And I know what a lot of our listeners are thinking. And they are thinking, it is Callum Drysdale. It is Callum Drysdale what's won it.
I think it's a generous.
Callum's going to be very modest, but as listeners might know, Callum was fronting a judicial review, a would-be judicial review into the deal. And what happened is that the government accepted, perhaps partly as a result of this campaign, which also had Lord Kempsell involved, that they would have to take the deal to Parliament, whereas previously they were trying to rush it through on the quiet. certainly I think that you guys are being justly credited with helping shift some opinions about this deal, helping show the world that it's a crock of shit, to use the technical term.
I think it's kind of, I think there are a lot of people who put a lot of work into to bring this to the attention of both sort of the country and the newspapers, and people like Yuan Yizu obviously deserve a lot of credit, as well as like the Chagosian Voices campaign. But well, I'd like to think that we did in our own little way move the dial, and particularly just through shouting about it, right? Because that's really what it seems to be, is that the Labour Party have not actually accepted that the deal is a bad one. They haven't committed to stopping it. This is just an optics thing, right? They concede that with reform doing so well in the local elections, and their own MPs basically knowing now that they're probably not going to be elected again in 2029, there's far less pressure on them to behave and toe the line. So they're expecting that a lot of these MPs who sort of came into political maturity during the coalition years, and for whom benefits was like a really big deal, right? Reacting against the hostile environment policies and sort of slightly performative benefit cuts of the Osborne years, these Labour MPs are there to give more money to what they would call like the most vulnerable, right? And so for the Labour government that they've now waited for so long to just be channeling money elsewhere almost is too perfect of a metaphor for like the misguided aims of this government.
It makes me think of my MP, Belle Ribeiro Addy, and I don't suppose that she took much notice of my email complaining about the Chagos deal. I'm sure she gets a lot of correspondence. Not much of it is reactionary as the letters that she gets from the King Charles III space station. But
well, of course, Tom, she can rightfully throw those in the bin because they're not coming from within her own constituency.
That's true. Well, we hover directly above it, which I think makes the boundaries issue a little more difficult. But although I don't imagine
boundary reforms have yet to consider the Z-axis.
Indeed. Well, one day perhaps we will have more of a voice. But I think even if I don't know Belle Ribeiro Addy's view on Chagos. I suspect she and I might not agree on it. But what I think this does show is that MPs actually do listen to an extent, and that if enough people kind of shrug off the chains of apathy and kick up a fuss, then I think the point can be made to MPs that the Chagos deal, for instance, is not a good use of money at a time when the country's finances are very, very tight. Callum, I would love to know what the feeling is on the inside of your campaign. You've got people like Lord Kempsell involved. Have you guys been cracking open the champagne? Like, what do you think the outlook is for this deal?
Well, Ross is rather excited and is ready. I think is ready to start running his victory laps and waving the turtle flag of the British Indian Ocean Territory around.
Does he think the whole thing's over? I mean, I did hear a rumor, Callum, that at this point, people like Morgan McSweeney are just thinking it's such a vote loser that they'd rather just kick the can down the road, perhaps until the next election, which they might well lose, and just make it somebody else's problem. Like, they might not formally cancel it, but they don't want to put their names to it anymore.
Yeah, I think you would have to see quite a dramatic about turn in both Labour Party polling, but also the attitude of people in the centre of the Labour Party and Number 10 to make this once again come to salience. I think what would be interesting is whether people like Lord Hermer, who have been big campaigners for it, whether they will object to this and whether they will resign, or whether actually this is something that Starmer says to him, look, we will keep it going. It will remain. So I think the real question is, watch that man when he comes out, this week. Does he seem another few shades of red darker, or just the normal gouty complexion that he normally has?
Well, I think one key question here that I think has some relevance to Lord Hermer is whether this about turn, if it is an about turn, is more about electoral prospects or perhaps a sort of broader political vibe shift. I know that when I've spoken to people who've worked in government about this deal, sometimes there is a sense among the skeptics that the world has changed since the end of history period in the 90s and noughties. Other powers are kind of muscling in. International law is not the perfect arbiter that it might seem to be, and that therefore this deal is representative of a naivety, really, that we might have to shed. So I suppose that my question, Callum, is whether you think this change of tack is to do with vote losses or a broader vibe shift.
I mean, I think it's been a rather astonishing week in statements that come out of Number 10, and not.
Yes, we've had to rename the station to the Sir Keir Starmer space station.
All of a sudden, we love Keir Starmer. What the hell?
His face on our pub sign now,
but
with red eyes.
I think as we say, right, there have been the Chagos deal has not been the only thing that's happened this week. There has also been the very dangerous Enoch Powell reference from our fascist leader.
Yeah. We should certainly get to that.
But I think the point that I'm making is this is not to support your point. This is not just a random event. It seems to be a deliberate change of tack inside, and many are very quick to attribute this to Morgan McSweeney, who seems to have garnered a reputation outside as the Dino whisperer and the man who really understands what
fifth column.
But I think it's hard to know to what extent that can possibly be true. I mean, there are those who would love to just think that Starmer is a sort of sock puppet through which McSweeney can ventriloquize. But there is, up to now, where has that been? That it seems to attribute everything to McSweeney, and then to say that it was his idea to make this shift seems odd and doesn't necessarily capture the thinking going on. I mean, I haven't seen a good answer to this, but I think before we say that this is Morgan McSweeney's genius, I think the most likely cause is the total collapse of the Labour Party in the local elections, right? For a long time, things like this have been, like the Chagos deal, like immigration, have basically been dismissed as online problem concerns, things that people actually don't care about. But clearly there is frustration enough to bring reform to, like, what is it now, 12 points clear in the polling, and give them loads and loads of new councillors. I suppose the only rational thing to do is to heed the wind. Well, get the sense of which way the wind's blowing and try not to get left behind.
Yeah, I think that's probably right, and it does strike me at the moment as pragmatism rather than a total change of ideological heart. I do wonder, Callum, whether you and Lord Kempsell and your colleagues on this campaign have actually heard from Labour MPs who might be articulating concerns about the deal.
Well, I can't say too much, but I think that the sense seems to be that there are MPs who basically feel that this has been extraordinarily poorly handled by Number 10, and for whom it is not why they came into Parliament. So they are not.
Yeah, they're being accused of treason, or at least Number 10 is. Right?
That matters less, right? I think the big thing that sticks in the throat of a lot of these people is the fact that money that they think should be going to these sort of most vulnerable people is not being put there. I think the immigration case, and I think we should maybe Tom, you want to lay out what's happened, but I think is a more interesting case because that seems to me to actually be a more significant change in direction. And I think before you do lay it out, a lot of people have said, "Oh, we've been here before, right?" Governments have in the past claimed to be sort of tough on immigration and then done very little, and thus have alienated most people, sort of everyone, because the left hates it when you talk badly, and then the right dislikes it when actually numbers don't really change. As we've talked about so much, for the left, when rhetoric and words are treated as like first class levels of discussion, i.e., what you say is the most important thing, the fact that he is saying this is sort of, I think, more indicative of his attitude than, say, if a conservative or a reform person said this.
Yeah, well, let's recap for listeners who are not the kind of hyper-focused immigration autists whom we sometimes speak to. The long-term context is that kind of every election, the electorate has said, please stop doing so much mass immigration. And mass immigration has gone up and up and up, and it peaked under Boris with, I think, more than 900,000 net arrivals in a single year, the Boris wave. And this seems to have become pretty unpopular and probably had something to do with the shellacking that Labour received in the local elections recently. And that seems to have prompted this speech from Starmer that you mentioned earlier, Callum, where he said that we were becoming, or risks becoming, an island of strangers. And so Starmer said that this experiment with mass immigration had to come to an end, and that as a result, the government were going to make some changes. So we've talked on the show about indefinite leave to remain, which is when some Boris waiver or whoever comes here, get a job, and then after a little while they can apply for indefinite leave to remain. It takes 5 years or so, and that's basically citizenship status. So you don't need to be contributing anything. You become you pretty much become part of the furniture here. And the worry among policy experts we've spoken to is that the scale of the influx under the Boris wave was such that the taxpayer was going to face, I think, £240 billion of liabilities, because many of these Boris waivers, as you would in their situation, bring dependents, and it creates a huge welfare bill. So it looks like the rules are going to change such that there'll be a few more roadblocks before essentially getting citizenship status. Now, people have had different reactions to these rules, haven't they, Callum?
Yeah, I mean, there have been, I think, the fairly classic responses in that you've got some people saying it's outrageous that the rules are changing, and there are others who are delighted. And then I think, as is inevitably going to take place, they're saying, right, you've done that, now we need to go further.
Yeah, and I think there's some skepticism as well, right? That this will actually change much. It might.
Well, of course, it was. The changes were subject to consultation, Tom. So,
of course, they are subject to consultation. We live in
this is all a moot point if the stakeholders don't agree.
It's but it's a kind of isn't there someone you forgot to ask? And the someone is like some faceless quango. So not only do we have a faceless quango or two involved, it might also be that these changes will essentially result in perhaps a mere 100,000 fewer people arriving. So maybe we'll go down from like 700,000 to like 600,000, which might not be addressing this enormous taxpayer bill as much as we would hope.
Yeah, I mean, people. I think a lot of people resent or object to this idea that this is going to be costly. As you said about the dependents, these people weren't just coming to be social care workers; they were also bringing, nanny who's got complicated tuberculosis and a gammy leg.
Yeah, and like we've said before, we can't really fault them for that. But unfortunately, this is just a very, very expensive way of doing good. If we're going to be housing them and giving them healthcare at taxpayers' expense, we could simply send money abroad and help 10 times as many people if that was our priority.
Yeah, but that's obviously not what people who support this want, right? If you regard borders and the selection of who you let into the country as fundamentally racist, then there's nothing that can be said to convince you that this is like a wise decision. You know, the idea even that some people could be economically not productive or not supportive is just not even a permissible thought.
And like the Chagos deal, this apparent change of heart on number 10's part has resulted in, well, there's been some enjoyment of it online. A lot of kind of based Keir Starmer memes, that sort of thing. It's been a wonderful day for kind of the Tom Joneses and the Sam Bidwells of this world, hasn't it?
Well, I mean, the line is that the posting to policy pipeline gets shorter every single day. That before long, that you actually will, when you make your Twitter account, you will also receive a number 10 pass in the same email.
Well, there's this Finding Cunley account on X, and who knows? Maybe Cunley was Morgan McSweeney all along. It's just extraordinary how short that pipeline has become, as you say. And we should give credit at this point to Tom Jones, a guest of this pod, and David Cowan, a listener, and or at least Tom's been taking some credit for this paper.
Well, exactly.
Yeah.
There's a man who doesn't shy away from from describing his role in this.
No. He's a wonderful man. It was a very entertaining guest, and probably does deserve some credit. And just to recap to the listeners what was in that paper, that was a year or two ago for the Adam Smith Institute, and Tom and David wrote basically about automation and how economies like China's are starting to use more advanced robotics and automating lots of things. And those countries which have chosen mass immigration as a short-term fix have ended up having less automation. So that's why these days when you get your car washed, you don't put it through a machine, or rather the machine is just like four kind of surly Romanians. And it kind of typifies what they think is a wrong-headed immigration approach that could be replaced with very Anglofuturist automation. So Callum, I put it to you that based Keir Starmer is in fact an Anglofuturist, and he's nixing the Chagos deal. He's dealing with the Boris wave, embracing automation. Have I drunk too many pina coladas today?
Well, I mean, you're certainly looking a little sunburnt, but I think to be honest, as I said, the victory lap is probably premature from all of us. I think the lesson from this is that unless you are able to summon up a new political party that threatens to get 30% of the vote and replace more than 200 of the governing party's MPs, you're probably not going to be able to influence policy. I think I'm a little bit more pessimistic and think that actually a lot of this is for internal sort of silence, internal dissent, and basically fear in response to reform. I mean, can you imagine being a Labour MP at the moment, that you effectively arrived and everything that you wanted has been ignored? There have been NICS increases, cuts to winter fuel.
Well, it started so well with adding VAT to private school fees. But now the pensioners are having now the rich pensioners are having their winter fuel allowance taken off them.
Well, yeah, and maybe the hope was that was enough, right? That you're sort of you get your one dose of class envy and class war, and that's you'd better be happy with that and shut up. I can't really imagine what it would be like to be a Labour MP, particularly now that the things that you were a couple of months ago saying were dangerous far right radicalism are now coming out of number 10, right? That cases that that people might have found themselves going to jail for tweeting or writing about are now supposedly official government policy.
Yeah. I mean, it's possible to imagine that had Keir Starmer tweeted the phrase, something to do with the phrase "island of strangers" a few months ago, perhaps in the riots last year, then maybe he would have had a knock on the door from the police. It does seem that things are changing very, very fast.
What do you actually put that to? Because I think, as much as I would like to totally claim credit and say that the Anglofuturism podcast is the leading indicator for Labour policy, and Morgan, we're activating Agent Morgan internally. The snows over the Volga are very beautiful in the spring, but. Is it reform? I think that is the only reasonable explanation. And potentially, what I think is interesting is because of a lot of Labour parties sort of struggle to actually understand why anyone would find themselves voting for reform. It's a bit like the Americans, right? Who, when threatened by some Soviet plans for some fighter that was only sort of poorly described, just spent £1 billion building a better fighter, and then it turns out that the Soviet one was just made up all along. That what seems to be happening to me is that the Labour Party is sort of responding to a bogeyman that doesn't really yet exist, but are sort of summoning it or almost creating it in the negative space by acting.
I think that this goes deeper than reform. I think that reform are surfing the tides of history, much as we're kind of bobbing around on these more gentle currents in Diego Garcia, and the tides of history, I think, are a little clearer in aspect when you think about sentiment towards mass immigration on continental Europe, for instance. It might be that just through kind of buying X and let's say tweaking the algorithm, Elon Musk has accelerated some sort of shift in the public.
I can't believe that. I don't believe it. I don't buy it. I think
came out of nowhere.
No, I don't think it came out of nowhere. But I think it is
simmering away, right?
It is the tweeters. It is the sensitive young man's dream to be at the heart of what makes the future, and thus it is the tweeter's dream that just by spaffing out a couple of lines every now and then that they have rewritten the world. There was the rise of this sentiment across Europe, in Germany, in Spain, in France, in Italy, not in Poland, but I don't think many would describe Tusk as a standard Anglo left winger. The tides of this have been going on for a while, and instead of it being a tweet started initiative, what was the line that they played? They played on the Vietnamese radio to tell all the Americans to leave Vietnam and come to the base for evacuation. I think that gives way too much credence to the sort of the left wing idea that it is only words, and if you just say the right combination of words, people will dance to your tune, right? I think this is the product of a long process of largely people on the right, but I think not exclusively, relearning ideas about nationality and community, that we are seeing this play out in a way that doesn't really fit into a lot of the sort of left wing depiction of immigration, right? We've all heard the line that, oh, it's the wealthy who want to sow dissent and turn brother against brother, regardless of creed or color. But the idea that this has been like a top-down, racist program, I think has just been like so thoroughly discredited that this is in many ways a locally driven thing that has come often from the areas that have like experienced the most immigration, right? There was a line about 40 to 50% of white Britons in London are planning to vote reform, which is quite a turnaround from what one might once would have said about like London being the socially liberal and socially progressive part of the country.
Well, and I think those socially progressive parts of the intellectual elite, as well as the social progressives in London and Westminster, have for some time had the kind of hegemony where they have been able to indulge these ideas that it's a good idea. It's a good idea to get rid of Chagos. It's fine to have kind of historically unprecedented immigration, even though clearly the electorate doesn't want it. And it seems like we're at this very interesting moment where that hegemony is looking a little bit weaker, and where some of that received wisdom is being questioned in, I think, a more forthright fashion than we've been used to.
Yeah, I mean, my cynic's view is that this is just like classic kind of Turchin-esque counter elite, where basically a load of like overeducated underperformers have basically gone, oh, I can't get my job at the Big Four, I'm going to throw my toys out the pram, right? Like there's a case to be made for this is the inevitable process of like overproduction of clever people who, deprived of like the life that they think they deserve, see the system then as one that's like holding them back, and thus the most dangerous thing to have in your town, in your capital city, are a load of like unemployed, overeducated young people, and particularly men.
What? So it's educated young men chatting shit about politics who are the ones to fear.
Yeah, without a doubt. There is that all like upsets have been driven by this is a very structural reading that people have been annoyed because they've seen like asset prices rise in such a way as to make houses out of reach to anyone but like people with the very best of jobs. I think there was a very interesting line I read about conversation that I was having today when I was cleaning up graffiti. And that was not, listeners,
applied Anglofuturism.
Well, when I told my friend about this, his first thing was, "God, is that as part of a court order?" So you can tell, you can see what high esteem my friends hold me at.
Well, let's fill the listeners in on what this trip, this graffiti scrubbing trip was. This is just
I was cleaning graffiti around Old Street, but let me just finish this point that and I was having this conversation today with someone who worked at The Economist, who was saying that there's an interesting phenomenon whereby from like 2000 to 2008, you see that even though interest rates are sitting like quite nicely at 2%. And to all intents and purposes, this seems like a period where, the central bank has basically won. The great consensus of independent central bankers stabilizing the currency and ending boom and bust have like triumphed. That at the same time, this was happening at the same time as like a huge amount of globalization and the moving of work, of manufacturing, of jobs and industry to the Far East, and particularly to China in this period, that is fundamentally a deflationary process, right? That should have lowered prices and made life a whole lot cheaper. However, interest rates still chugged along at around 2 to 3%. And I think what's notable there is, and it's maybe a stupid or like obvious point, but in the basket of goods, if some are getting cheaper and you still want to maintain, like, sit at 2%, how do you do it? You do it by inflating other prices, and that this is like the central bank driving by aiming for this like seemingly arbitrary target, have been able to maintain this the like 2% number, but it was at the cost of a whole load of other things during what could otherwise have been quite a deflationary period. I thought it was an interesting idea.
Callum, a little earlier, you modestly dropped into conversation that you were beneficently partaking in a graffiti scrubbing operation in Old Street. And I think this is worth talking about as well, because the project organised by friend of the show, Joe Reeve, who runs the Looking for Growth campaign with Lawrence Spaceport. And I was at the Arsenal game, but Callum meanwhile, was by Old Street, scrubbing loads of horrible graffiti off walls and street furniture. Were you not? Could you give us a bit more background on that, please?
Well, it shows what exciting lives we lead, doesn't it, Tom? That you were there watching Arsenal probably secure second place in the Premier League, and I was getting covered in paint and getting sort of like bizarre looks from members of the public. I tell you what. The aim of it was Joe Reeve saying that he was frustrated by how much graffiti there was, and so thinking, well, why can't I do anything about it?
Yeah, it is horrible. Like it feels like the trains are just, sometimes the interior of a train carriage will be like festooned with graffiti. In a way that I don't.
Yeah, and it used to be apparently it used to be that TfL wouldn't run a tube train if it was thus adorned. The idea being that people who do this do it for like attention, and they do it for cred. And so if you learn that however much you tag this train, your mark isn't going to stay there for long or isn't going to be visible, then it becomes like a pointless exercise.
Right, there's a broken window.
But they've sort of given up on this, right? Like you get on trains, the Bakerloo line, and it's totally covered. You're in sort of like what looks like I don't know, some painted den of vice.
But not in a good way.
No, not like the painted dens, Tom, that you and I like to attend.
But so Joe Reeve brought together 20 ruddy young Anglo-futurists or kind of or street furniture enthusiasts, and set you to work on all this horrible stuff.
Yeah, it was here's a roller, here's a pot of paint, get to it.
Wait, so were you getting rid of the graffiti, or were you painting?
We were doing both. We were doing both. I think things like brick is very.
Boy, don't you need a license? Don't you need a license for painting walls on the street?
Well, the tragic thing actually was all the people coming past us would come and go, oh yeah, are you putting up a mural? And then we'd say, no, we're just covering over the graffiti. And then they got rather disappointed actually. So maybe that was our failing, that people sort of didn't necessarily quite understand the idea that we could just be trying to make things look less like garish and covered in tags, that instead we must be contributing to the problem.
Or maybe you can warm them up to it by doing some more tasteful mural of someone Venerable Bede, which I'm sure those passers-by would be very excited about.
Joe was suggesting that we find an artist who was willing to draw paint onto our like freshly laid canvas, the city to be built on Dogger Bank, or the one on the Falkland Islands, or the British Antarctic Territory. So if you are an Anglo-futurist graffiti artist, which I know the Venn diagram
with an enthusiasm for heraldry
is probably quite full, or if you'd like to have a shot at it, I'm sure you could even use oil paints on the walls. That might bring us a larger constituency of our listeners.
And are you going to do any more of this graffiti scrubbing in future?
I think we've seen the like difficulties of doing it with paint. I think painting over a surface is like quite an involved process, and particularly if you're going over things like particularly stone and brick, it's quite a faff. And also you've got to use special paint for brick. So, and metal you want to scrape. So I think the next step will be investing in a steam, sort of either a pressure washing system or like a steam treating system that are able to using like very hot water and pressure be able to scrub this off. I think that the sort of impressive thing about it was just that you had a whole load of people who were willing to spend a Sunday doing something to improve their local environment. We're all like quite accustomed to things getting worse, and it used to be that works done in your parish or in your vestry were done like at the expense of the ratepayers, which promoted a certain civic pride, and also whether that was from your like the goodness of your heart and your like civic duty, or not wanting the money that you spend paid in rates to be wasted. There was like a link between how the money that you gave to the council and the things that happen. That connection that has been broken by the government putting all of these statutory requirements on councils, which mean they have to cut all the sort of non-statutory things like libraries, things like bins.
Well, it's also that we just move around more, right? People aren't rooted to communities in the way that they were when they were, the nth generation of their family to live there. Like we're more itinerant and transitory. We might live in a borough as youthful young gentlemen. We might live in a borough for kind of 2 years at a time. Like, what do you feel like that?
I think that's true. Yeah, but that's true for the young. But not everyone in London is a bright young professional, right? There are an awful lot of people who have settled and are trying to raise families who are not moving from scuzzy flat to scuzzy flat.
All their belongings on their back.
Exactly. Hung over their shoulder in a bag, as I will be, Tom, coming to live with you in a week or so.
In those periods where we're not in the Starmer space station, yeah, we have an Earth base at a secret location in South London.
So I think there is it is something of a cop out to say that people are not in one place. Younger professionals who let's be honest, throughout history have always been the least rooted and least like involved in a place. These are the people who are trying to make a difference, and I think that's I think they are to be commended, and it's a sort of evidence to all of us that we could do more. Right? Go to church, meet your neighbours, organise street parties, be a good citizen. It's not that difficult.
Slipping in, go to church, Callum. That was shameless.
I'm not ashamed. I'm. I think
very
proselytizing is always good, but generally, right? We used to. If you live in London, you live in a parish. You're a member of. There is an opportunity to go to church and to partake in the like community that has to offer.
Well, I think at heart, you should be the Anglofuturist you want to see in the world.
So smells, bells, and tea on a Sunday morning.
Well, listeners, the sun has climbed high in the sky here on Diego Garcia. Callum and I are going to open a few more cold ones, and we will bid you goodbye for now. Though, before we do, let's give the listeners a heads up, Callum, on what's coming their way.
Yes, well, releasing later this week on our normal fortnightly release schedule will be an interview with Alexander Fitzgerald, the industrialist determined to build factories across Britain, and we went to speak to him and spent some time at least in his West London factory to hear just about how Britain could get back on its feet and start manufacturing the things that it needs day to day in order to make us both safer and happier and wealthier.
And we've got another couple of guests from Westminster who we're also very excited about as well. And in due course, we will say who they are on Twitter, and you can submit your questions as earlier. I think all that remains is to sort of get out the begging bowl. And say if you're a patrician listener, then send us loads of money so we can like buy some video gear or something. Anything else you want to add, Callum, or should we open those cold ones?
No, I'm up for a warm bottle of speckled hen.
Wonderful. All right, well, listeners, thank you for joining us. We will speak to you very soon.
Goodbye.